Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Economic Forum. Our program begins promptly at 8:05. Thank you. Good morning once again, our distinguished NCBA customers, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second NCBA Economic Forum for the year themed 2021-22 Budget, Strategy for Resilient and Sustainable Economic Recovery and Implications for Business. My name is Rosalind Gishuru, and I am the Group Director for Marketing, Communications, and Citizenship here at NCBA, and I will be guiding the program this morning. Once again, thank you very much to all of you for taking the time to join us on this very important conversation. At NCBA, weighted by our economics desk and experts within the bank, we seek to empower our customers with key updates on changes in the private or public sector. We provide an outlook of the economy and dialogue and potentially discuss implications on our businesses. Today's conversation is centered on the recently read Kenya National Budget 2021-22. And to steer this conversation this morning, we are delighted to be joined by a distinguished panel of guests who will help us navigate the conversation around the theme today. And on the panel today, we have our keynote guest, Mr. Albert Mwenda, who is the Director General, Budget, Fiscal and Economic Affairs at the National Treasury. We have on the panel as well, Ms. Flora Mutahi, who's the chair of KEPSA and the CEO of Melvin Marsh International Limited. We also have Mr. Fred Omondi, who's a partner at Deloitte. We have Mr. Kwame Owino, who needs no introduction. He has graced our economic forums many times, and we're very grateful. And he is the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs. And from within the bank, we have none other than our Group Managing Director, Mr. John Gashora. We have our Group Director, Corporate Banking, Mr. John Okulo. And last and certainly not least, we have our Director and Chief Economist, Mr. Raphael Agum. And at this point, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite our Group Managing Director, who will give his remarks. He will also allow Mr. Raphael to come in as our Chief Economist to amplify the conversation and to set the stage for today. He will then, and the Group Managing Director will then come back and invite our keynote speaker, Mr. Albert Mwenda, to make his remarks. So without further ado, allow me to invite our Group Managing Director, Mr. John Gashora. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Rosalind, and our speakers, colleagues, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. It is always a pleasure to meet with all of you on this platform and exchange ideas on the macroeconomic environment that we find ourselves navigating in these volatile times. As is now our tradition, every year, after the presentation of the National Budget Statement, we meet on this platform to decipher what the government fiscal plan, including the spending priorities and financing options, mean for us as businesses and economic actors. The significance of these conversations has been elevated in recent years by the unprecedented challenges presented by the pandemic, whose severe impact remains evident and longevity uncertain. Indeed, we acknowledge that with the challenges presented by COVID-19 pandemic, budgeting has become even more challenging, even as the reliance on fiscal levers to resuscitate our economies becomes especially central. For Kenya specifically, balancing between supporting economic recovery and maintaining a sustainable debt path continues to necessitate difficult and sometimes painful economic trade-offs. That said, we applaud the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury for presenting a fairly balanced budget, considering the underpinning environment. We also note that delivering the fiscal plans as proposed will be an onerous task. As earlier indicated, the budget comes against a fragile, albeit improving, economic landscape. Whereas businesses and households have increasingly adapted to a low mobility environment, the start and stop scenarios occasioned by the uncertain path of the pandemic may keep growth below the country's potential for much longer than we'd all want to see. For this year, our in-house models expect economic growth to recover to 5.3%. That's an upgrade from our earlier projection of 4.9% that we gave in November of 2020. This is, however, slightly less optimistic than the Treasury's 6.1% growth forecast. Frankly, for our much desired prosperity as a country, I would actually be happy were it to turn out that the Treasury's projection is more accurate than our own projections. We believe that the bulk of activity will be in agriculture, construction, education, and ICT sectors. Tourism may also see strong growth, but only due to low base effects. That said, considering that a significant portion of growth will be underpinned by the low base, we believe that the multiplier effect on incomes will remain low. This means that achieving the 2.1 trillion revenue target for the year, which is predicated on tax reforms and better administration, remains an even more important policy priority. At the same time, vaccination remains a major policy imperative in achieving strong, sustainable, and inclusive growth. To this end, we are glad that the government allocated an additional Kenya shillings 14.3 billion towards the COVID-19 vaccination campaign. This may enhance confidence in the later quarters of the year and hopefully hasten the pace of reopening and consequent recovery. To be sure, as noted by the CS in his budget statement, fiscal pressures remain. In this regard, we applaud the government for the recent efforts at debt restructuring, the shift to more concessional financing, lengthening of the tenor of local public debt will create some fiscal space, reduce liquidity pressures, and allow for the much needed public spend. More importantly, it is allowing us as banks to crowd back in the private sector. This is complemented by other initiatives, including more investments in the credit guarantee scheme and other mechanisms aimed at boosting liquidity in businesses. It is our hope that ministries will heed to the directive to settle all pending bills by end of June. This will not only put businesses on a sound footing, but will provide some comfort for banks, complementing the government's recovery efforts. As NCBA, we are committed to working with the government to support businesses and households through our lending and other balance sheet activities. The bank has continued to collaborate with the government and other players through the credit guarantee scheme in order to enhance access to credit by MSMEs in the credit guarantee scheme. With these few remarks, allow me to invite our Chief Economist, Mr. Rafa Ragu, to provide some brief remarks on the NCBA Kenya economic update. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, good John. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And of course, your able leadership at this time of crisis. I think the crisis has been with us almost going 2 years and still growing. Welcome everybody for our call this morning. We appreciate your partnership as always. And as Rosalind did mention in our opening remarks, we are most grateful for your patronage through the years. I'll very briefly just underscore the important outlook that John has given, which is that as NCBA, we project that the economy will rebound to about 5.3% GDP growth for 2021. He did mention that our estimate or our projections are slightly less optimistic than the national treasuries, which is at 6.6%, for some reason that I guess the conversation today will unpack. The way we are thinking about the macroeconomic environment is pretty simple. So it's at two levels, actually. One is just a thematic forecast in terms of what we see as the key drivers of the macroeconomic environment. John did allude to the increased adaptability at the household level, but also at the business front, especially with regard to the emerging trends on the business models by different entities. That's one. He did also mention the unprecedented policy support at the fiscal side and also on the monetary policy side, and still growing. So we've seen this on the global numbers, on the global horizon, but also locally. You can remember that we did have some counter-cyclical fiscal policy response at the onset of the crisis. And even in the just released budget, we've seen an extension of the same, including an implementation of an economic stimulus program over and above the big four priority agenda that the government has been pursuing for the last couple of years. So at a thematic level, those two or three themes will guide our positive outlook. Of course, there's a question about vaccinations, which also is, or of course, moving at much slower pace than we'd have liked to see. But we've seen, at least at the global front level, including at the G7 conversations, we've seen noted improvement in that regard. The way we've gone about forecasting, and anybody will tell you forecasting the outlook in these times is even dicier, is that we have outlined three scenarios. What we are looking at as a base case scenario, which is the more realistic one in terms of our foreseeable future. And then we have a best case scenario and a worst case scenario. In all three scenarios, we do not see a situation where the desired herd immunity is achieved. Of course, you'll remember that projecting economic outcomes is heavily predicated on the path of the pandemic. So to that extent, I guess the key North Star that everybody is chasing is herd immunity. And we've seen varied performances in that regard across the world. In our scenarios, we do not see, at least in the forecasting horizon, a situation where we have herd immunity projected at about 65–70% of vaccination. We don't see that in any of the scenarios. Be that as it may, we do see, however, increased adaptability, as I've said, and John did underscore. That adaptability is going to allow some meaningful return of economic activity. And in our base case scenario, that's what's projecting our growth to 5.3. We've also had the benefit now, post the budget, to see the expenditure priorities by the national government that are likely to be key drivers to some of this increased adaptation of business responses that we've seen. So in that base case scenario, 5.3% is our GDP output number. Of course, that's a revision from our earlier number of 3.9. John did mention that. We were a little less optimistic at the end of last year. Keep in mind that the key lever that we were looking at that point was the Q2 sharp contraction. We had a complete lockout of the services sector, including the education sector, for much of last year. We've seen that return, and even with the additional sort of lockdown as at 26th of March, which lasted only a month, at least we have seen that the school calendar wasn't interrupted. And to the extent that that is still on course, we see that baseline scenario being a likely one. Our best case, which we'd like to see, of course, goes at 7.6, but as I've said, it depends wholly on the path of the pandemic and certainly on vaccinations. On the whole, the forecast, just very briefly, has some risks. If you listen to John's subtext, the risk remains on the fiscal side. And indeed, we are really privileged to have Mr. Mwenda from the National Treasury, at least to give us some thoughts around that. And to the extent that that remains the key risk that we see, I think with the recovery on the revenue side, assuming that we get this economic output back and therefore tax on output goes up, we should be able to see us at least in a much better shape than we saw in 2020. So as in summary, I think we will get into the in-depth discussions on the sectoral dynamics. I think that's very key to our clients on the call, including further additional webinars with yourselves in terms of just unpacking the sectoral dynamics. But because we have very esteemed cast today, including representation from a high level of the National Treasury, allow me to take it back to John, and then we'll get into a more detailed conversation on the same. Thank you, John. Back to you.
Thank you, Raphael, for that very quick in-depth look at our projections. With those few remarks, I'd like to now invite our keynote speaker. As mentioned, Mr. Albert Mwenda is the Director General of Budget, Fiscal and Economic Affairs at the National Treasury. He's responsible for overseeing macro and fiscal policy affairs, intergovernmental fiscal relations, financial and sectoral policy issues, budget issues, and public procurement affairs. Mr. Mwenda has over 20 years of experience in central government and private sector organizations, having been instrumental in the National Treasury in various capacities, including as an advisor and later director of the Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations Department of the National Treasury, which he helped establish. He made significant contributions in the development of Kenya's policy and legislative framework for public finance management and management of fiscal relations between the two levels of government. He was also involved in the formulation of the Public Finance Management Act of 2012, the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act of 2015, and the Public Audit Act of 2015. He has also worked as a consultant at the World Bank, the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, United Nations Development Program, UNDP, the Norwegian People's Aid in Rwanda, the State University of New York, and he was also at one time the chief executive and member of the board of directors of the Institute of Economic Affairs. He possesses excellent knowledge of public finance and budgeting, as well as fiscal policy. Mr. Mwenda currently sits on the boards of the Commission on Revenue Allocation and the Competition Authority of Kenya as an alternate to the Principal Secretary to the National Treasury. Let's all welcome Mr. Albert Mwenda.
Thank you, Mr. John Gashora, the CEO NCBA, distinguished guest on this platform, and the distinguished customers to the NCBA. I am also proud to speak in this forum because I also happen to be one of your customers. But to begin with, I must say that it's the first time that I'm speaking in this forum, so I don't know how you usually structure them, but I'll try my best. I was asked to, speak on highlights of the budget for the financial year 21-22, and therefore, let me begin. But what I want to do, because the background is important, I want to highlight what the background has been. And because it informed the choices and the pronouncement in the budget statement by the Cabinet Secretary to the National Treasury. Then I will speak to the economic policy context and how we see it. Then highlight some critical structural reforms. Then I'll come to the main issues, that is the fiscal, and conclude with the tax measures that have been proposed. In terms of background, we are all aware that the financial year 2019-20 towards the end, and the financial year 2020-21, we have had to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the containment measures that the government pronounced. These significantly impacted negatively on the lives, the livelihoods, and businesses. Of course, because of this, the Cabinet Secretary had to respond, and he responded promptly and in a significant way through fiscal policy, some fiscal measures, and then the Central Bank of Kenya also came through with some monetary policy measures to cushion businesses and citizens. Of course, and this is important, government had to then forego some revenues in the form of the tax relief measures that significantly, affected the capacity of government also to generate revenue. You will remember VAT was reduced from 16% to 14%. PAYE and corporate income tax, the highest rate, the rate was reduced from 30% to 25%. And we also lowered the turnover tax from 3% to 1%, and gave 100% tax relief to the low-income earners, those earning below 24,000 shillings per month. But besides that, government also intervened by providing some additional allocations in terms of cash transfers to the vulnerable, especially targeting the urban vulnerable, and we believe that kept a significant number of the households, going and to cope with the challenges of no incomes, and putting on the table food. The interventions by the central bank were also critical in unlocking the liquidity in the market. The reduction of the cash reserve ratio, the central bank rate was reduced from 8.25 to 7%, and the cash reserve ratio from 5.25 to 4.25. Of course, the end result of this was to release money that was then available for in the money market. Now, in light of all this, we also, before we embarked on the budget process, talked to the people, and there were some key feedback that we got. What were Kenyans concerned about? One was the need to bring down the costs related to the COVID-19 treatment or management, and then the need to access vaccines was top on the list. They were concerned about, because many had fallen into unemployment, then food security, because food insecurity is an income problem. And if people fall out of jobs, then food security becomes a concern. Then there was the high cost of living. They were concerned that there was a high cost of living, and therefore the need to keep the costs of especially fuel and others that fuel inflation. The unemployment, and this was not a surprise because many had fallen out of jobs. Poverty and inequality was another concern. And then, and more important, and this has been in the media, is the high level of public debt. And therefore, in the statement, you will see that we sought to address, the CS sought to address many of these problems. Now, of course, despite the interventions that we made, the tax relief and the economic stimulus program, those challenges still remain. And therefore, in this year's budget, the intention was through sustained implementation of the Big Four and focusing on a few critical areas. And this is articulated in the economic recovery strategy. And also intervention, the continued intervention through an economic stimulus program that was sustained. But more importantly, also, we have worked on a program which is aimed at also dealing with some of these challenges. And we are grateful that some of our partners have come to support us. And in particular, I would like to single out the International Monetary Fund. They have come in a strong way and provided financing of up to $2.34 billion US over a period of 3 years. And what is the program that we sought support for? One, and this was part of, it was underscored by the minister, and it will guide our fiscal policy and other structural reforms. And therefore, it is important to highlight what we sought to do under that program. And there are four key objectives under that program. One, we have sought to effectively enhance our capacity to respond to COVID-19. So you will see interventions by way of even accelerated vaccination program, and it is being supported by that program. The second objective is to reduce the risks that the risks that are rising from the high stock of debt. And the third area is to reduce the vulnerabilities we are seeing from the weak financial state of the state corporations. And a few of them, and of course you are aware, Kenya Airways is having problems, Kenya Power and Lightning is having problems, a number of public universities. So under this program, we are seeking to resolve or to address those weaknesses. And then number 4 is to strengthen the monetary policy framework and financial, achieve financial sector stability. Now, having said that, there is therefore, to achieve those 4 objectives, there are responses on the fiscal side that would be expected. One is to lower our fiscal deficit, and this over the medium term. And we see our fiscal deficit dropping from 8.7% of GDP in the current financial year to 7.5% of GDP in the next financial year, now under the budget that was presented by the Cabinet Secretary. And ultimately, in the financial year 24-25, we see ourselves coming down to a level of 3.6%. Now, how will this be achieved? And I think it is important at this point to also clarify. One, we have proposed that there will be an effort to enhance the administrative capacity of KRA to collect revenue, but also there will be policy measures that would help us drive our revenues up. And then number 2 is to explore alternative modes of financing. As we speak, the PPP unit has been revamped, and we expect significant projects to move to closure in beginning the financial year 21-22. Already we have the Nairobi, the JKIA, James Gishuru Expressway, and there are others, including the one on Rironi Mau Summit Road, which is at the tail end. Now, having said that, it is also important to, a statement by Mr. John Gashora about reprofiling debt is also on the agenda. You will see some significant debt operations beginning next financial year, and these are already anchored in the fiscal framework. If you look at the summary of our fiscals, you will notice that there will be significant debt operations aimed at lengthening the maturity of debt over the medium term, so that we reduce pressure, the immediate pressure in terms of servicing those debts. The second reform you will see with regard to debt is, and it's already articulated in the budget statement, is the shift from short-term debt instruments, the T-bills, to more long-term debt instruments, so that mix moves towards level of 57 to, I think, about 57 to 43% ratios, the split between bonds and T-bills, with ultimately reducing further over the medium term, so that there are more bonds funding, that the funding is mobilized through treasury bonds more than the T-bills. Now, in terms of moving to the economic policy context, and I listened carefully when Raphael was speaking in terms of the way they see the economy. We have a different view. Of course, what is clear is that both of us have a view that there will be recovery. Of course, this is largely driven by one, a recovery of also the big economies, and generally the global economy as it recovers. There are also spillover effects, and we also benefit from that in terms of trade and flows and capital flows. But our budget for the financial year 2021 is premised on the background of a projected global economic recovery, which reflects significant support by governments to, especially the big economies, to drive that shift. And the global world economic outlook projects a global recovery of growth of 6% from a contraction of 3.3%. From the domestic level, we see us growing our growth improving from what was reported this, or the 0.6% that we project for the 2020, all the way to 6.6. And I think it's important to note that this is largely, besides the expected opening up of the economy, relaxation of the containment measures. There is also the base effect in that you are growing from a lower base, so therefore naturally the growth would be higher. If you have a weaker, you are growing from a weaker base. Now, what will drive our assumptions are, one, that we continue having a stable macroeconomic environment. Here we have not had much of a problem. Our inflation rate continued to be within the target. I think in May we had 5.9%, and we see it generally in that range, supported by prudent fiscal and monetary policy. Implementation of the Big Four is very critical to sustaining to that rebound, and therefore you will understand why the CES also made some significant allocations to the Big Four agenda. So investment in infrastructure will continue. We also expect that there will be favorable weather. That is very critical. If we experience the shocks that we've had in the past, then that growth will be affected, but we remain optimistic. We also are hopeful that we'll be able to maintain interest rates low and stable to support private sector credit. Rebound of horticulture and tea exports is critical. That has also in the recent past supported the growth of the agriculture sector, including the remittances by the diaspora. Now, in terms of infrastructure investment, we expect to continue investing in the rail, the Nairobi commuter rail, expanding the meter gauge rail. So there will be significant investments, and I may not go into the details because those are already there in the statements, and I'm sure you might have seen that. But I would like to highlight a few numbers that are important on the fiscal side. So the expenditure that was proposed in the financial year 2021, the total government expenditure is at 3 trillion and 30 billion. I think it's important to note that this does not, because this has been in the media, what is the budget for government? It is not, it is certainly not 3.6. And I will explain. It is what the expenditure is 3 trillion and 30 billion, thereabout. Although we have redemptions. Redemptions are a balance sheet item. So when you are rolling over your debt, you plan to roll over your debt, those items will not appear in your income and expenditure statement. And therefore, that does not comprise an expenditure. It's more of an arrangement to roll over your stock of debt. So it would only become an expenditure if we were not able to then convince our investors to roll over those instruments. So our expenditures are at 3 trillion, comprising of recurrent 1.2 trillion, development 669 billion, and then we have then expenditures to judiciary 15.6 and parliament 35.8. Now, how do we propose to? This gives us a deficit of 900. About 7.5% of GDP. That translates to 900 and sorry, it's about 930 billion Kenya shillings deficit, which translates to approximately 7.5% of GDP. How do we propose to fund this? Net foreign financing will cover 271.2 billion, and then net domestic financing will be at 658.5 billion. Now, in terms of the key expenditures, remember I said that Big Four, investment in the continued implementation of the Big Four is important to drive that growth of 6.6%. And in that respect, the Cabinet Secretary proposed to spend 142 billion on the Big Four agenda, which is 20.5 billion goes to manufacturing, 60 billion to programs and to enhance food and nutrition security. Universal healthcare takes 47.7% from that amount, largely going to rolling over of universal healthcare. And then affordable housing, 13.9 billion. Now, we also propose to continue funding of the economic stimulus program. And in this area, we have allocated 23.1 billion in the following areas. One is towards enhancing business liquidity, 2.6 billion. 6.4 towards school infrastructure, desks and all that, and also using local labor. And there are several other interventions, including an enhanced capital to the credit guarantee scheme that we are partnering with 7 banks to implement, including the NCBA. Now, there are other allocations to specific sectors, and since these were in the budget statement, and for example, in terms of sectors, security was allocated 302.1. No, sorry, enhanced security was allocated a total of 302 billion. Infrastructure sector 310, education 202, environment and protection and flood control and water harvesting 93 billion. And then counties are getting an enhanced amount of 409.8 billion in the next financial year. Now, that's in terms of expenditures. In terms of key policy reforms, I would like to highlight just a few. First, with regard to procurement, to enhance efficiency, the government has proposed to decentralize procurement of ICT equipment and services. Previously, it was decentralized. It was a bit slow and not efficient. And they're also locking out the small businesses. So we believe by decentralizing, there will be more participation of the vulnerable group and therefore also providing income opportunities for the youth, women, and persons with disabilities. Number two, we are rolling out an electronic government procurement system to streamline procurement in government services. And this will also enhance efficiency and remove or eliminate opportunities for rent seeking, and also eliminate or reduce operational costs in government services. We have also, in the pension sector, there are three critical reforms. One, as you are aware, we have rolled out the National Superannuation Scheme. We are now moving to automate the process of processing the superannuation scheme. The key effect of this, you will see a running theme is enhancing savings. Previously, we were under a defined benefit scheme. That has implications on the capacity of government to mobilize savings. With the shift to contributory scheme in the public sector and the potential high numbers enrolling in this sector, we expect savings would increase, and therefore there will be additional resources for government to tap into to fund development programs. Number two is that we are also revising the pensions policy, the national pensions policy, to anchor those reforms and also to harmonize, particularly the schemes in the public sector, so that you have, they move towards contributory schemes, for example, and also provide for a harmonized framework for managing those schemes. And finally, we are proposing to introduce an informal sector pension scheme, a national pension scheme for the informal sector, again intended to provide a platform for the majority in the informal sector to save. And that will help to unlock, again, savings that would be, again, available for government to enjoy, to tap into purposes of funding development. We have also focused on the motor vehicle automotive industry. We have, as you are aware, we have provided tax incentives in this area. For example, we have removed duty on locally assembled motor vehicles. The importation of the CKD kits in this sector is duty-free, and we have reduced the corporate tax from 30 to 15% in the past. What has been a challenge is the assembly of passenger vehicle has not picked up as well as the assembly of the commercial vehicle. So we have entered into an arrangement or negotiations with the players in this industry, the Kenyan motor vehicle assemblers and the CABA. And we have come up with an agreed framework that is being considered to support the assembly of an affordable passenger vehicles. And we see this as transformative because it will unlock opportunities for employment, especially if the linkages with the local content producers, those who are in manufacture of radiators and those parts. So if we deepen and support this sector, we see growth and we see employment opportunities in that area. In terms of other areas, and I've already alluded to this, on the state corporations, we have introduced a system, a management information system to better manage state corporations, to have a better oversight and manage the financial risk more effectively. We have also, on the payment of pending bills, we intend, working closely with Senate, there are discussions going on to better enforce compliance on the payment of pending bills by invoking the powers of the National Treasury and Article 225. We have already even initiated an audit through the Office of the Auditor General to audit and confirm the eligible bills so that businesses are also not suffering. You will see a greater involvement of the Nairobi International Financial Center Authority. They will, before December, be publishing the framework for attracting investment into Kenya, and therefore position Kenya as a financial hub. And that work is already at an advanced stage, and shortly you will hear them pronouncing themselves on that reform. Allow me to quickly move to and highlight some of the tax measures that we think are important as I move towards concluding. First is to note that under the EAC, we had a series of meetings under the EAC framework leading to the budget, and a number of agreements we reached a number of agreements. First, to support the iron and steel industry, which we see as also critical in terms of also growth of this country. We have proposed that iron and steel products be imported at 25%. The import duty on leather and footwear products will also attract an import duty at 5% rate. The unassembled motorcycles will, under the duty remission scheme, will attract a 10% duty. To protect the furniture industry, we have proposed to raise the duty to 35%, the import duty on the finished furniture products. The inputs on to encourage manufacturing of baby diapers and to reduce the cost of baby diapers, inputs for manufacture of baby diapers have also been kept at 0%. Now, on value added, there are a number of measures. Remember, we would like to support the health sector to facilitate the rollout of the universal health coverage, but also the rollout of COVID interventions. So the CS proposed VAT exemption on health products and technologies. There is also a VAT exemption on equipment for generation of solar and wind energy to promote clean energy. There is also proposal to have bread under the schedule for exempt for VAT Previously, there was an error where bread was under two schedules. One, the schedule on the zero rate and the schedule on VAT exempt. To correct that error, we have proposed that bread be exempt. Now, on the excise duty, we have proposed that to introduce excise duty on locally manufactured sugar, confectionery, and white chocolate. We have also proposed to remove excise duty on imported glass bottle to support that industry. We have proposed to harmonize or to change the excise duty rate on motor vehicles. Previously, it was a standard at a standard rate of Kenya shillings 11,608. We have proposed that we convert this to a rate of 15%. The excise duty on nicotine pouch is at 5,000 Kenya shillings per kilogram. This is similar to what is to the duty that is imposed on other nicotine products. Excise duty on betting is on being introduced at 20% on the amount staked. On income tax of critical importance is we have extended currently the universities are allowed to deduct up to 50% additional over and above 50% of the expenditure for 3 additional interns that they employ. We propose to extend this to TVET, but also increase the numbers in order to encourage employment creation. We are proposing that this number of the number that qualifies for deduction to be increased to 10, so that the businesses that employ up to 10 graduates from TVET and from universities can enjoy, can deduct expenses relating to those costs of employing those graduates. Now, National Health Insurance Fund will going forward qualify for insurance relief. This relief is available to the private sector. We are proposing just to extend it to NHIF. We have proposed to also on the management and professional fees for the extractive sector, we are proposing that the harmonized service fees this service fee be harmonized to what is already being charged at 10%. That the management and professional fees be harmonized with withholding tax on management and professional fees be harmonized with what is payable on other services in the extractive sector at 10%. Now on import declaration and railway development levy, we propose exemption of goods imported in public interest to promote investment for goods that are of the value above Kenya shillings 5 billion. And this would then allow the CS to be able to approve exemption for import declaration fee and railway development levy for goods that are imported in public interest to promote investment, as long as the value of those goods is above 5 billion Kenya shillings. This is a summary of the tax measures, and I believe there are more that I have not touched that were covered, but I'm happy to then respond to any questions from the floor. But in summary, and as I conclude, this budget, you will notice there were no significant tax increases, and it is aimed at businesses and citizens to go through. And we do expect that all factors as presented holding constant, we should be able to recover and grow at a rate of 6.6% in the financial year 2021. I thank you, and over to you, Mr. John Gashora.
Thank you, and I'll turn it over to our host, Rosalind.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard from Mr. Albert Mwenda, Director General, Budget, Fiscal, Economic Affairs from the National Treasury. He has given us a very in-depth view of the Kenya National Budget 2021-2022. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our GMD, our Group Managing Director, John, as well as Raphael, for their remarks and NCBA views on this as well. At this juncture, we will turn to a panel discussion that will be moderated by Raphael. And on the panel this morning, we have Ms. Flora Mutahi, CEO, Melvin Marsh International, but recently appointed chair of KEPSA. We have Fred Omondi, a partner at Deloitte, and Mr. Kwame Owino, CEO, Institute of Economic Affairs. So over to you, Raphael, to moderate this discussion.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. I think the Director General did spend a lot of time and detail on the budget. We really appreciate that. For those of us who may have missed the reading of the budget statement, I'm sure Mr. Mwenda has given quite an elaborating. Now, I will not take any more time. We have really a distinguished cast of speakers. And I'm especially gratified to note that we are having Ms. Flora Mutahi on our platform today. Those of you who follow the news, you know that as we keep shattering glass ceilings, she just did one recently in high elevation as chair of KEPSA, which is the key platform for private sector engagement with government. She's been to our platform before, and we are really grateful for our partnership. So I would not want to take any additional minutes on the budget. I'm sure our panelists have considered views just like many of you, including ourselves. I just want to give a first draft of 5 or 7 minutes to Flora to outline our thoughts regarding the budget and or reactions. I'll do the same with Mr. Kwame Owino and Fred. And then if we have any further time left, we can have the back and forth as we've done before, but really, this is for them to give us their reactions or their thoughts in terms of the macroeconomic development as outlined on the fiscal policy framework by government. So Flora, I'll give you the first opportunity, and congratulations again on that deserved elevation. Thanks.
All right, Mr. John Gashora, Albert Mwendwa, fellow panelists, Raphael, and customers of the bank, good morning. Thank you very much for the accolades. I will do what I can as the chair of KEPSA. But first, I would like to just, thank Mr. Mwendwa for taking us very elaborately through the budget that we saw. And of course, we understand that it is on the backdrop of trying to really help us recover from where we've been. And of course, even the theme of the budget makes it very clear that they're really just trying to help all the sectors sort of recover. So KEPSA basically engages government a lot, when we are doing the budget preparation planning. And I would actually like to thank them for giving us the opportunity and basically to be transparent in just the way they negotiate with us back and forth, involving private sector in the process, and also the adherence to the Public Finance Management Act. So as we look at the budget that was basically proposed this year, like we said, building back better, we noticed total expenditure at 3 trillion, like he said, revenues are at 2.1. However, with a deficit of 9.2, he then said what he's going to do, how they intend to fund it, which was going to be, I think, 600 and something billion was to be financed from net domestic borrowing and 271 through net external. What tends to happen, we see with this is it worsens the credit situation, because what tends to happen with the financial institutions, they find it easier to continue to lend to put their money, park their money with government where they are earning the 11 to 13%, as opposed to taking a risk on SMEs and the growing economy that is quite hurting right now, that needs to borrow, because they'll probably say, for me to actually afford this, I will charge it at 17%. Right now, I think we know the mood will not sort of get us there. So this is something that continues to worry us in the private sector when we are looking for funding, and we are not finding it. We know how many, I think it was said a third of SMEs actually collapsed during this period. So those people are looking for funding. Yes, we have soft funding. We have the MasterCards, the foundations giving money, but to go to a bank and raise money would be very difficult when the government continues to basically crowd us out. Another area that I found quite interesting, and okay, fine, we put 23 billion allocated to the economic stimulus program. We're grateful for it, but really globally, if we look at economic stimulus programs, they basically constitute about 5% of a country's GDP. So considering our GDP is about 10 trillion, this would be about 500 billion. So when you look at it vis-a-vis 23 billion, it looks quite meager. I understand the situation that we are in. I understand where Kenya is in right now, but maybe it's also time to start looking a lot at our costs. We can't keep having these very high, high targets on revenue, high costs. It's time as a country, perhaps we turn back and look and see where can we make a savings on our costs. When we look at the support for the Big Four agenda, 142 billion, again, we are grateful for it. But when we look at figures of 2019 and 2018, I think 2019 and 18, we were at 400 billion. In the 2018-19 budget, I think we were at 450. No, 450 was 2019-2020, and 400 billion 2018-2019. So this is a decline of almost 68% between 2019 and 2021. Showing less political and economic commitments to an agenda that the government has told us they're very committed towards. And the Big Four, I think very, very well chosen pillars, 4 of them. But when we start then putting such a large decline, 68%, I think is rather large, and perhaps an area where if we could have afforded it, it would have been, I think we should have committed more to it. And of course, universal healthcare, having earned what we have, and the vaccine rollout, that is appreciated. And especially the 2 billion for the credit guarantee scheme, this will definitely really support, private sector and the businesses that have really found themselves at a difficult period around now. When I look at the tax policy measures, corporate tax changes, the thin capitalization, I think I've been reading a little bit about, why should the government be getting involved in how businesses are going to capitalize themselves? And this is something that I feel there's going to be a little bit of pushback, and we hope we're going to be able to discuss. When the government sort of starts saying, why are we being punished for putting money, especially to, when you have a startup? Definitely, we know startups are difficult to fund, and therefore, when we are only told we cannot exceed 30% interest deduction, I guess this we feel is rather punitive. Utilization of the tax losses, we've noticed that has been extended to over 10 years. Now, I think it was 10 years and I think it has been extended. That is definitely a plus. However, we are aware that the minimum tax argument is still in court and there's been no ruling on that yet. But definitely utilization of our tax losses for a longer period than 10 years is something we appreciate. The extension of the apprenticeship rebate for TVET is good. Is definitely very, very welcome, and not only graduate, because definitely we've seen what is happening in the education sector. A lot of people are going to have to end up in these TVET education systems. So it's something we definitely appreciate. But making it 10 students, just a word for the SMEs. An SME during a year might not be able to take 10 students. Yes, I know the government is trying to promote employment, and therefore they want 10, but perhaps, based on the size of the business, there could be a little bit of an encouragement where we say, but if your business is between this and this size, if you took in 5 or if you took in 3, we would definitely appreciate it. Digital marketplace, there's a reprieve for the players, if I'm not wrong. Maybe Mr. Mwenda will correct me later, or one of the economists. But I think for non-resident digital players is where they're going to be charged. But for the local ones, there'll be no charge, which might be an incentive for them to definitely, set up base in this country. The strength given to communication authority to actually block these websites or businesses that are doing e-commerce is also appreciated. Investment allowance on straight line, very good, because it drives certainty to our books. It's not reducing balance and everybody sort of knows. Renewable sector, that's a big win where, they are able to do a 50% investment deduction, very encouraging. Employment tax, the relief, small, but definitely a step in the right direction. And withholding the tax, the harmonization, that is something that is good. When we come to the value-added tax, I think that's a little bit of sad news for exportation of services, which has been classified from 0 to exempt, meaning now they cannot put in their input tax. In this area, there's a lot of BPOs who are non-resident entities, and therefore it does not really help the local players, because it means they cannot compete internationally. For example, Uganda has really boosted their BPOs and actually even removed VAT and done reverse VAT. So especially now, I think this might be an area that we perhaps try and push back and have some negotiation around. And another area in VAT that might not be very encouraging is the one of passenger cars, if I've understood it correctly, because VAT will not be allowable. So therefore, even if your business is buying a car, here I can stand to be corrected. For my business, we will not be able to offset it for the business. So making cost of transportation a little bit more expensive, which I'm sure is not what it was meant to be. However, like on that one, I must say I'm not exactly certain, and then perhaps the economists here can assist me. The rest on reclassification around VAT, medical sector has been favored, which we appreciate, and we can see where the government is coming from. They are trying to accommodate and understand the position that we are in, reducing VAT and giving exemptions. Brilliant, we appreciate. On the Big Four housing, the benefiting for the, I think it is the rates, removing the VAT on that, which is nice because the government is trying to encourage investment in this area. Bread, this is going to make it a little bit more expensive, and milk for infants, removing it from, I think it was 0 to exempt, then makes it a little bit more expensive for the Mwananchi, and I think already there's been a lot of pushback on that. If I look at excise duty, the shift for the jewelry and the motorbikes, this is just, I think, about fairness, moving from units to a value-based system. That one, I guess, tax is all around fairness. Excise duty on chocolates, I find this a little bit unfair, local chocolates, because we're trying this is at a stage when we are really trying to encourage local manufacturing. So I think these are areas where it would be good to protect. I do know for a fact that or at least I do know Uganda at some point had tried to really protect their local industry. And so this one I think is an area where for locally produced products, we would like to encourage that we do not put expenses on them. Nicotine at 5,000 per kg. I know we call this sin tax, and I know Mr. Mwenda was saying he was sort of regularizing to some tax. But what tends to happen is they're going to make local investments. The investors who have made investments in this country sort of start looking for other fairer areas to sort of do their business. I agree government does raise money through excise, but perhaps I think I know the proposal that had been given by this company was about 1,000 shillings per kg. So 5,000 tends to be on the higher side. So I'm sure we're going to have a pushback. On the gambling sector, the 20% on excise, again, I know there's going to be pushback. I know Gor Mahia is already complaining, but I think that's a debate that we are going to take forward. When I look at customs duties, the duty-free importation window for raw materials, this was done to protect local industry. We are very, very happy. Importation of iron and steel, again, local protection. We are happy on that. Baby diapers, excellent. Import duty on products for manufacture of leather footwear will be retained at 25. Again, I guess in the aim of trying to encourage local manufacturing. Import duty applicable to furniture extended to 35% for another 1 year. Again, local manufacturing. And we started seeing a lot of the importance of local manufacturing, of course, during this COVID period when the supply chain was really, really challenged. And I do know companies who said they went locally and bought furniture and they're thoroughly impressed by the quality that we are getting. So this is an encouragement on our area. Duty-free window of importation on roofing tiles, again, extended remission for a year. That is excellent. Again, excise duty on, I think for me, on the tax administration side, I think this is the final point I'll perhaps want to make. Again, we do work in a global country, and we do know that we are moving towards harmonizing our taxes with global practices, and therefore this is around fairness to enhance tax compliance by foreign taxpayers. Again, I think this is definitely in order. There's one here around amendment through, oh yes, the amendment where they are trying to, the KRA is going to be the one who will be allowed to change the tax policies. That one is something that I'm sure you've already seen the pushback, because what we say is, I don't think he should be the judge and the jury. What we have, when we have it going through Parliament, we're able to lobby and discuss our cases in that manner. So I believe, NHIF tax relief, again, very, very encouraging. We're happy about that. I believe for me, I may have forgotten a few things, but I'll come back. One other thing, actually, I remembered, when he's saying that they're going to put in a system for state corporations to drive efficiency, very, very welcome, because again, efficiencies will help bring down our costs, which will help us reduce perhaps our deficit. Audit on payments of pending bills, again, very, very encouraging, because what you tend to find is a lot of these SMEs that have closed, not only now, but in the last 5 years, have been due to I supplied government, perhaps through AGPO or through some system, and I'm not being paid and I've had to shut down. It didn't help that, or compounded to that, then COVID came and they've had to more have had to shut down. So I think I like the position where they're taking, where they've put it under the Auditor General, who will be inspecting whether payments are made. And we are really looking forward to the release of all funds, all payments within by the end of the June 30th, to actually enable all the companies that have really suffered to come up. Maybe I'll stop there and I'll converse as we proceed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Flora, for those thoughtful reactions, giving a really clear private sector response or reaction to the budget as read, of course, on Thursday last week, but also as has been detailed by Mr. Mwenda to ourselves just a couple of minutes ago. You raise, I think, a very key point on the potential risk of crowding out. And that, of course, is a debt question that Mr. Mwenda spent some time also trying to allay. So as a private sector, of course, that bulging public debt has implications for government borrowing. We see that risk, of course, given just the limited amount of resources available, crowding out the private sector. By design, by the way, and I think Mr. Gashora did allude to this platform is meant also to catalyze that policy dialogue with government. So to the extent that we are getting these reactions, I think Mr. Mwenda will appreciate that it will be useful in terms of implementing the budget, but also considering further policy provisions. Reduction or perceived reduction on commitment to the Big Four in terms of just reduction and allocation. I guess with the limited fiscal space, you can see why, but I guess it is within our right to try and push back on that, see whether the government can remain to that, remain fidel to that commitment. I think the size of the stimulus is a question of fiscal space again, 5% of GDP or more. I think you've seen the US case is significantly, I guess because they're richer. So if you look at OECD response, that's part of the policy response that we've seen. It's just a question of wealth. So the wealth they can be able to actually play back. You finished on the tax proposals, and so did Mr. Mwenda. I think we are very privileged to have Fred, who, as it stands, I guess, excuse my tautology, is the tax partner at Deloitte. So this is what he feeds on every day. I'll probably give him the next batch to give us a sense of his thoughts with specific reference to the finance bill as proposed here.
Thanks, Raphael, and all the other guests and panelists, and good morning, our audience. So Flora, incidentally, has touched quite a bit on the tax measures. So in a way, she's stolen my thunder, but not to worry. I think I'll first just give my overall view of the budget. And, Mr. Mwenda also, gave a very good background and rationale for the different priorities that the government has put in place. So I will not repeat that, but I think just some high-level observations. One is, of course, as the budget continues to grow, then there is more pressure on the funding side, and that's where tax comes in. So Mr. Mwenda did allude to, the fact that there are no new tax measures per se, but more towards strengthening tax administration. Which is a good thing, but I will say experience from our side and taxpayers generally is that this tends to mean more aggressive enforcement measure by the Revenue Authority, and of course that places a bigger burden on businesses. I think the problem we probably have there is we don't distinguish between really compliant and non-compliant taxpayers. So you tend to find the pressure is the same whether you are a good taxpayer or a bad taxpayer, so to say. And in fact, I would say that the pressure is even felt more by those who are already compliant, because the revenue tends to focus on them to really increase the collection because they're easier to reach. So that is an area that we probably need to look at and see how we can, incentivize or, encourage those who are more compliant and focus on really the areas where there is non-compliance or areas that will grow our tax base and expand the net, including, the so-called informal sector. So that's something just to be on the lookout for. And in fact, a survey carried out by the CBK, I think it was in March this year, tax was actually identified by the CEOs as one of the biggest concerns, even ahead of the impact of COVID. So it tells you that taxpayers are feeling a lot more pressure, and that could be negative from the perspective of the burden on the investors. Two, my other observation is just around in terms of the priorities and the allocations. So I'll just pick on one, which is the manufacturing sector is one of the big four agenda, and obviously the government has time and again reinforce the fact that they want to grow the contribution of manufacturing to GDP. But then I see some contradictions from a tax policy perspective, where we've actually reversed a lot of the incentives that are available to manufacturers, including some which have not really quite been well tested, like the recently introduced electricity rebate, which came after a lot of debate around the cost of inputs, the key one being energy costs. So the government introduced electricity rebate, but even before it was really put in place, or rather applied, that has now been reversed. And we are seeing a general trend, of course, of reversing incentives and allowances, which I'm aware is meant to address the issue of reducing the deficit. But we need to then look at the areas which are critical for some of our priorities, like manufacturing, and ensure that we retain some targeted incentives to be able to grow the contribution of manufacturing to GDP. So that is something that is important to consider. Now, the cabinet secretary did talk about pending bills, and it's clear that that's one of the key issues that the government is focusing on. So we welcome that, but my observation on that, Mr. Mwenda and the Treasury, is that one of the pending bills that is less talked about is tax refunds. So if the Treasury could devote more funds towards tax refunds, it is really a pain for taxpayers, and it's getting worse because I know we focus more on VAT refunds, but there is quite a huge chunk of income tax refunds that the Revenue Authority refuses to basically pay, or even to allow taxpayers to offset, because of course that affects their collections. So that is something I think Treasury should sit back and look at ways to make sure that is dealt with in a timely manner. Actually, the law does provide for a 90-day period, but that is not being implemented. So it ends up being a key hurdle and pain for taxpayers, especially at a time like this when when a lot of businesses are struggling for cash flow and trying to recover from the impact of the pandemic. So that is something that would require a lot more attention. Looking at where we are in terms of the recovery path, I also believe that the government should probably have allocated much more towards purchase of vaccines, because we do know that the economic crisis is in a way precipitated by the health crisis. So the faster we can, drive the vaccination campaign, the quicker we can, recover and get back to near normal economic activity. So yes, there's been some allocation, but it's quite minimal. And I do know, of course, that we will also get vaccines from the COVAX initiative, and other, donors. But I think we should drive this by also allocating a little more to be able to fast track vaccination now that, supply is becoming a bit more available compared to the past few months where supply has been the main issue. So that's something I think should have gotten a little more priority in terms of the allocation, because a lot depends on how we are able to recover from the perspective of the COVID pandemic. And looking at what the government had to forego last year, for example, in terms of taxes, which was over 100 and close to 180 billion. So we are saying if that was the costs, or rather the impact of the pandemic, then we could probably have afforded to allocate a little more to help us recover quickly, because that will stimulate faster recovery and therefore help businesses to recover quick and government to collect more from a tax perspective. Now, going to the tax measures, I think for me, the key ones that stand out in no particular order, and Flora did touch a bit on them, so I'll not belabor the point, but some of the key ones include the proposal to exempt exported services, which we find quite odd, because in line with the global consensus, really exportation should be zero rated. And like Flora said, this will definitely impact not just the outsourcing business, but also we have a lot of headquarters of companies which are located here, whether it's regional headquarters or global, whatever you call it. So if you make it more expensive for them to be located here, then they'll look at other options. And this is something I think should be looked at. I know it was probably motivated by the need to reduce VAT refunds, but I think it's probably going a little too far. So that is something that we find quite out of place. On the income tax side, there weren't really any new taxes, so that is a good thing. What we see is more around tightening the rules to be able to either reduce deductions like the interest deduction that Flora also did mention, or to bring into the net, multinational players from a permanent establishment perspective, looking at issues of control and how that can be tightened to ensure that dealings between parties which have a control relationship are carried out at arm's length. So really, those are just tightening of the rules and adopting, the global recommendations around protecting the tax base and preventing tax avoidance. So we do see that is the trend across the globe. So nothing to really call out there, except that, of course, in terms of implementation, then we probably are a bit, we pick on the ones that tend to favor us, and we probably forget some of the ones which would work, for the benefit of taxpayers. So that is something that we should probably consider. Now, on the VAT side, we talked about VAT on exported services, so that is something we need to look at. I think there wasn't any increment on the VAT. There was a move rather to move a lot of services from zero rating to exempt. Again, this is driven by just the need to reduce tax refunds. So we understand where that is going. I think our main proposal there is that we should make it a bit more stable, because we keep seeing changes, to the VAT schedules every other year, and then they are reversed after 1 or 2 years. So we probably need to have a critical look at it and then, settle on a particular policy that can then apply for a considerable number of years to enhance predictability. On the excise side, the main losers here would be the betting and gaming industry, with the introduction of the 20% excise duty on betting and gaming. Again, this is something which had been proposed last year, and the sector managed to convince Parliament that it was not a good move. So it has been reintroduced. So it is something that we want to see how that will impact the sector. But I think it's not just the excise duty. I think what the sector has been alluding to is that there's been, over-taxation of that particular sector. And we do understand, of course, from a government perspective in terms of trying to discourage, what I would call maybe unhealthy, gambling. But then that I guess needs to be balanced against the interest of also promoting, the activities within the industry. So that is something that will be debated, and we look to Parliament to make that decision. There's been an increase in actually excise duty on motorcycles. I know the way the provision reads is more a change from a specific rate to an ad valorem rate. but the net impact will be an increase in excise duty on motorcycles. So that is something, for the common mwananchi in terms of the bodabodas that will impact them. And also, of course, the increment in terms of furniture, imported furniture now being subject to higher excise duty. So that is something that, is meant to protect the local industry. But it means then that imported furniture will cost more. Also, from a tax administration perspective, we've seen the extension of what we call the statute of limitation, which is the period that remains open for tax audits from 5 to 7 years. So this basically signals that there'll be a lot more, scrutiny in terms of tax audits, because then the Revenue Authority can reopen, more years to really look at your compliance with the tax legislation. So that is likely to negatively impact taxpayers, because it means that there are more years that are open for audit, and then you have to keep records for a longer period. From a digital services tax perspective, which was introduced last year, and we've seen a lot of changes, but I think the key one is just that residents will now not be subject to digital service tax, which is a welcome move, because this would have put a lot of businesses in tax refund position, given locals also pay withholding taxes, and then digital service tax would have been an extra credit, which would have likely put a number of them into a refund position. So this is a welcome move. But on the other hand, there's been an expansion of the scope of digital services tax. So now it will apply to any activity or business carried out over the internet, which will widen the scope. Again, this is in line with the global move to really get more from the digital economy. So it's not really a surprise, but I think the issue is more around the implementation, just being able to clarify a bit more around how different businesses are affected, because we do know that many businesses have one form or the other, carry out one form or the other of, a portion of the activity over the digital platform. So there's a lot of interpretation issues around how different businesses are affected, but otherwise it's expected that there'll be more focus on the digital economy and how that can be taxed in a more effective way. So in terms of some giveaways for taxpayers, there are not many, but a few reliefs like the NHIF one, which has been touched on. So now taxpayers will be able to claim relief for contribution towards NHIF. There'll also be investment allowance for investors in off-grid energy. Again, this is positive because we've seen a lot of development in terms of off-grid energy, and it opens up the sector to enhance affordability, but also access to electricity, especially in the rural areas or areas that are not covered by the national grid. So those are some of the few giveaways that were there. But overall, given the limited scope for the Treasury to really support or finance the ambitious budget, we expect that going forward there'll be a lot more burden on taxpayers. So I guess our call would also be to the government to manage the expenditure side, because if we don't manage that, then we'll continue to face pressure and maybe widening deficit and probably even worse, the debt situation. So we need to look at the expenditure side. And without getting into the politics, I know this is also affected by the structure of government. So it would be critical to really look at how we can make sure the government structure is efficient and really does not lead to growth, in public expenditure, especially to non-priority areas. So those would be my overall remarks. I'll take it back to you.
Thanks very much, Fred, for that detailed rendition on the finance bill. I think on the, so if you listen to our thoughts around the thematic forecast, I think 15 months into the pandemic, it's pretty clear that COVID is endemic. So to the extent that we are making macroeconomic forecasts, of course, really, it's predicated on the war and the pandemic. So I could not agree with you more on the allocations on vaccines. And to the extent that it's a singular, perhaps the most important limb into delivering these projections that we are making, we would have wanted to see more than the 4.2 billion shilling allocation, especially just given the challenge that we have ahead. So I could not agree with you more. Let me bring in Kwame. We are conscious of time. Kwame, just your remarks.
Okay. Thanks everyone. You know, as I was coming this morning, I asked myself again, what do we think could have happened differently? And perhaps I think we start with, there's some positive things in the budget, so maybe I'd like Albert to hear this. One of them is obviously that I think core spending in sectors that, I mean, in the public goods, which I believe part of it is education, or at least in terms of its, all those have been supported, or rather there's been maintenance. So it's clear to me that government intends for the school calendar to run this year, which is an extremely positive thing, I think. There's also some allocations, of course, to devolve governments. I mean, 370 billion, which is not small change. So if it is used properly, I think in terms of the growth prospects, it might just deliver that. In as much as I agree with Raphael and everybody who's mentioned that the core risk for the economy and budget execution this year will remain the question of how fast recovery takes place regarding the COVID-19 situation. And what worries me is that I think for a long time, most of last year and towards the end of the year, it was clear to us that this was a dense urban problem, which is mostly Nairobi, Mombasa, and therefore being able to contain it in those areas was essential. And I think a good job was being done. It's clear now that it's running across Kenya's transport corridor, which has both implications for economic performance over the year, but also it means that government will have to extend or be more keen towards extending the ability to manage COVID. I think the Nairobi case, all factors considered, is far, far better than other governments with facilities that are not as strong and perhaps not the capacity to manage. So being able to extend that will be a critical question about how the budget is managed and the execution and the growth path. So I think the positive story aside, let's talk about one of the things that worries me is just the deficit. I think the deficit worries me, not just because it's a big one. I think if GDP growth rates happen as they do, but because we've all mentioned the risk, if it doesn't, it means that deficit picture will even get more complicated because the deficit might have to be extended on account of the fact that if growth doesn't come and the incomes don't show and revenues don't show, then obviously that deficit picture gets more complicated. And of course, it makes Albert's job even more difficult. So the deficit picture, I think, worries me for that issue. That's the 927 or about 950 before the grants is large, all factors considered. Even with a growth case of 6.6%, which is extremely positive, that deficit picture remains one that is difficult. So one of the things that I would expected much, much more for, and I think the last two cabinet secretaries in the last 2 years, the word fiscal consolidation has been right there. But I don't see fiscal consolidation as much. In fact, what I'm beginning to see is that while the Treasury does a good job trying to buy itself fiscal space, it is using that fiscal space to expand new spending and not necessarily consolidating expenditures, which is a difficult thing. And I think that's part of the reason why with the crisis last year, the government was not able to respond to a big fiscal stimulus. I mean, or rather, yes, a fiscal stimulus on the spending side. I think most of the stimulus came from the appreciated adjustment that government had to make in terms of cutting back the tax rates for VAT and obviously for income tax. Whatever it is we may say it did for government revenues, I think it was extremely helpful in maintaining household expenditures and maintaining growth in that side, which gives me a new way about thinking about what fiscal stimulus can actually come from the tax side, tax cuts, as opposed to spending. And maybe that's something for government to consider. I come down to the fiscal side, the fiscal budget side. The main assumption that the Treasury made is that I think the recovery and the adjustments of taxes back in January was far too early, in as much as I understood the pressures of actually maintaining expenditures and maintaining the critical expenditures that are required and keeping Big Four on balance. But I think, Albert, you guys cut you cut it too finely by going back to the taxes too quickly, in my view, and that might have undermined the growth path. In as much as it looks like it's sustained, but I was beginning to think that towards the end of the year, it was clear that the fix was over. The difficulty was over, and perhaps the tax position could have maintained, especially the rates for income tax and for VAT could have stayed at where they are. And with an expectation of growth, maybe that would be consolidated. I'm also glad that Albert mentioned that the national pension schemes, because if you look at it, the reason I am sympathetic to the Treasury's position is the political pressures notwithstanding, is that there's very little flexibility in Kenya's budget today. And that's worrisome, because if you look at the main things that are growing expenditures, it's actually, so the entire budget grew by, I think, if you talk about total expenditures at 3.6, with the primary deficit taken out, one of the things, or rather with the taxes, the interest on debt taken out, one of the things that is driving expenditure is actually, one, the debt and the pensions payments, both of which are growing faster than GDP growth rates and actually just tracking very closely overall budget growth. Now that you mentioned that the national pension schemes are actually being consolidated, I think it cannot be done fast enough, because that's the only way government will buy some space to be able to, over time, in the medium and actually in the longer term, to be able to manage both the budget, both the debt, but also more importantly, pensions payments, which for a long time have depended on new revenues to be able to come. So if we have public sector workers contributing to their pension and also meaningfully, so that government contributions are, so that it's away from a pay as you go towards a contribution to the pension scheme. And I understand why some public sector workers are reluctant. I mean, if you get a pension just by virtue of the fact that you've retired, regardless of whether you save for it or not, I understand where the incentives lie. So that correction is also one that's appreciated. Then I speak quickly about pending bills. I think that the question of pending bills is also, in my view, if you think about pending bills, I actually think they add to the debt position, because the pending bills also constrain budget expenditure. Because if the pending bills have to be paid, it means that whatever numbers we account for, in addition to paying debt, the pending bills, which is money that is already spoken for, regardless of what the other plans are. So they actually displace what the real spending would have been. But more importantly, they also constrain government's own revenues, because the people who are owed money, some of that money would be government revenues, in the sense that they net off what their incomes are, and the tax of that would be for government. So it's in government's interest to actually manage pending bills, in my view, in a more urgent and efficient manner than simply dealing with it as a budget issue by year. So I think that the 2 weeks window that the cabinet secretary gave for all pending bills to be settled, to be honest, I think it's all going to be honored, because as you could see, many counties were still saying that they had money, about 100 billion that was due. So they're not going to prioritize pending bills if they are not paid wages. I hope they had won both ways, but basically the trade-off they're going to make is to actually pay their workers' wages so workers can keep coming in, and maybe pending bills, they'll pay quite a bit and all that. So maybe a more urgent policy, but more proactive policy about how pending bills are handled is something that we need to consider. But the idea of piecemeal payments for pending bills seems not to be working, and it's actually leading to just a backlog, which everybody kicks into the future. The other issue is state-owned enterprises reform, and Albert mentioned that as well. This is perhaps not the time, but one of the good things about a crisis that confide with government tight expenditure is to actually start to prioritize and re-energize, it might be the privatization program. I know the Treasury, the Privatization Commission have a problem with that, because people who sit in Parliament sometimes, for good or bad reasons, are completely ideologically opposed to privatization. But the size of Kenya's budget and the need for the public sector to buy space to be able to spend on their priority projects and issues requires that Kenya state-owned enterprises, parastatals, and actually government institutions be not only just slimmed down, but considering divestiture would be a useful thing in the medium term, but more importantly, which ones need to be closed. All difficult political decisions, but one that need to be made today and are actually for the purposes of good economy are essential. Because I don't think we can continue to plod along with government revenues growing and all those revenues being absorbed and the deficit continuing to grow at a faster rate. So basically, if you think about that, I'll conclude with one point. I think the budget is going to remain fixed for a while, and let's hope that the COVID situation raises. I also think that there is investment on vaccines, which actually is not 3.8, it's actually closer to, I think, 11 billion or 12 billion thereabouts, as based on the discussions that Treasury had with Parliament to revise it. It's still a good step forward, but it's not sufficient because, as Raphael mentions, the COVID situation is going to remain endemic. And for as long as we can't get everybody unleashed to go back into into work, the 6.6 is going to remain a bit of a fanciful figure. And the final one that we need to consider is, and I think a discussion needs to take place between private sector, government, and all arms of government, both the Treasury on one side and the Parliament. Because while no taxes have come in on the administration side, on the payment side rates, but the tax administration is actually adding to the burden of compliance in the sense that basically, even at the IEA now, we have to keep not that we shouldn't, but we have to keep records for another 7 years. All those have costs, but also the Tax Procedures Act is growing in tandem with the Income Tax Act itself. And it's almost actually, in our assessment, it's almost 1/3 the size of the Income Tax Act. So suggesting that while the rates are not growing, the compliance questions, and that brings us to the fact that I think the Cabinet Secretary mentions that the Income Tax Act is going to be reformed, but I actually think consolidating what tax policy is. And so I need to say that tax policy, perhaps, I don't say this to be flippant, we should make sure that actually any reasonable Kenyan should be able to file their tax returns by reading and responding to all the queries on our full scope page, A4 page, because what we have is increasingly, well, it gives jobs to accountants and lawyers who do tax administration, but actually the inefficiency that it generates in businesses is far higher than simply trying to because it looks like our tax system is increasingly a low trust of the payer, and you're introducing more and more rules with discretion to people at the tax administration or tax collection agency, which is also generating more issues at the tribunal, and all those have implications for how efficient the tax system is, but also business costs. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Kwame. Thanks very much for those considered views. The Director General has requested to respond to the question on funding for COVID vaccine. So I'll give him a chance before I hand it back to Rosalind to do that. But I note that one of our attendees, Mr. Vimal Patel, has had his hand up for quite a while. So maybe just very quickly, in a couple of seconds, could you just give him a chance to shoot his remarks or question?
Yes, thank you, Raphael.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, Raphael. My name is Vimal Patel. I'm the MD of Cosmos Limited, and I'm the Vice Chair of Federation of Kenyan Pharmaceutical Manufacturers. While I may be pleased with the budget, I still find there's an issue here, especially for the pharmaceuticals. We've experienced 18 months of COVID, and the things that we realize that vaccines, the availability of vaccines is very important, and also the availability of medicines. In the early part of 2020, when the COVID really hit us, India stopped exporting of medicines. And that's where I'm coming from, that I don't think the budget conclusively protects local manufacturing or encourages it. I mean, you have VAT exemption, but the VAT on services is a cost for us. That becomes a cost to us compared to the importers. So electricity and other services. The second thing is that nobody is going to make vaccines here in this country, certainly not me, because I don't see any protection towards local manufacturing. The other thing is that when we talk about UHC, we all agree that hospitalization is a high cost. And the real cost to save that high cost is to get people with the right medicines. Now, we're not tackling that because all the packaging inputs that we use in pharmaceuticals, which are specialized, there is still high RDL and IDF on it. Treasury is not moving forward to give exemptions on that. Or the second thing is that what I don't understand very much, that while I accept that they're protecting the steel and the leather industry, why are they not protecting the local manufacturing industry? And thirdly, well, I agree with having nappies duty free, but I grew up with a towel wrapped around me, and I don't see nappies are environmentally friendly. So I don't see which way we are going. Thank you.
Thanks, Vimal. Thanks very much for that feedback. We are glad the Director General is here, so it's probably we'll take that. So very quickly, I'll just give it to Mr. Mwenda. He wants to clarify something on the funding on COVID vaccine, and then we'll hand back to Rosalind. So we are mindful of your busy schedule this morning so that we can bring it to a close. Mr. Mwenda? Yes.
Thank you, Raphael. Quickly, there is an issue that keeps on recurring about government funding for vaccines. And it's an important issue because remember when I started off, I said the economic recovery, and you are right, Raphael, that the economic recovery will depend on how quickly we are able to achieve herd immunity for a significant majority of our population. And that discussion has happened, and we do have committed funding for vaccines, purchase of vaccines. And the total, the government expects to spend between this financial year and next financial year, approximately that 34 billion. 7.6 billion is already provided for in this financial year. And as we speak, there are engagements with key manufacturing companies of vaccines like Pfizer and J&J and the Oxford that manufactures AstraZeneca. So we have in this financial year 7.6 billion Kenya shillings already provided in the, and of course it will be confirmed in the supplementary to the expenditure has been approved under Article 223 because it's an emergency. We also have in the next financial year, we propose to spend 14.1 billion for purchase of vaccine. That there is commitment. It may not have been included because the financing was confirmed, I think, after the submission of the estimates, but it should be included in the financial years 21-22. So we have, then the balance would be covered under the COVAX arrangement. I thought I should clarify that so that at least the participants in these forums have the latest information. I know I would have commented on other issues, but let me allow the others who have not spoken.
Yes, Albert, and I think the maybe just 1 minute on Vimal's point. Really, it was feedback to you, as I understood it, with regard to pharmaceuticals and broader manufacturing strategy, given its criticality for the recovery effort. So, just a quick one on that.
Yeah, yes, and a quick one in terms of response to that. First of all, in terms of whether, because he was not very optimistic about manufacturing of vaccines locally. But as we speak, there is a task force headed by the CS Health that is at an advanced stage in terms of arrangements for local manufacturing. I won't go into the details, but there is an expectation that into the next financial year they might get into manufacturing, of course led by government. But in terms of support to the pharmaceutical industries and the health sector, if you look at the finance bill this year, there is a long list of items in both equipment and pharmaceutical products that have been exempted from VAT. And I would invite also, it may not be, maybe not everything was covered, but I think it's a good beginning that we are supporting health sector so that at least the industry can start, enjoying benefits that will result in lower cost of production. We may not have, because it's a balancing thing, and we will continue. As we speak, there was a longer list, which we had not finalized the discussions by the time we were finalizing the finance bill. So I remain, I think we will continue listening, but we've already, as a government, provided some support by extending exemptions to a number of inputs.
Thank you so much. Indeed, this is one of the benefits of our public finance management framework, as of course granted by the PFM Act. There's more participation these days, and so to that extent, at least we are seeing that responsiveness from the national government. Now, I'm very partial to this, and I'm really closing, but I'd like to just give Flora 2 minutes to make some closing remarks as we celebrate that incredible achievement. So, Flora, just 2 minutes to make your closing remarks. Yeah.
All right.
And excuse my partiality. I think we need to celebrate the ceilings when they are shut. Thanks. Go ahead.
All right. Like I say, thank you very much. I'd just like to thank you for having me on this. But the most important thing for business is predictability. If I'm planning my business, we all do strategic planning 3 to 5 years out. Of course, I know now that 3 to 5 years might be a lifetime. So it's going to end up being a little shorter. But I think the faster we move towards creating a national tax policy, I think the better and more predictability we are going to give the market, and therefore people who invest. I'm speaking for like one of my members who I know invested 2.5 billion into the country and has been unable to sort of roll out their project because of tax matters. So this year we put in VAT on rates. Next year, we take it out, we put it back this year. That is not working very well for business. So I think as we continue to develop as a country, it is important that we have stability in the tax policy so that it helps local investment and also foreign direct investment. Really, that's all I would like to say, and we continue the participation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us. Rosalind, back to you. We really are out of time. Back to you.
Okay, so thank you so much to our esteemed panel, Flora Mutahi, Kwame Owino, and Frederick from Deloitte. Thank you so much, Fred Omondi. I also just want to take this opportunity as we close to invite our Group Director, Corporate Banking, to give a vote of thanks and to close this session for us. So over to you, John Okulo.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. And I promise not to take more than 2 minutes. This is to thank Mr. Albert Mwenda, Ms. Flora Mutahi, Mr. Fred Omondi, and Kwame Owino for gracing this occasion. Mr. Albert Mwenda, as the guest speaker, you ran us through the background of the budget, the priorities, and how it all came together. And I think that there's been extremely useful feedback from all the other speakers who raised valid issues and also gave accolades in some aspects of the budget. Special thank you to Mr. John Gashora, our Group MD, for always supporting this forum. And I'd like to have an even more special thank you to Raphael and the economics team. If I could just request Faith and Stephanie to turn their cameras on just for a few minutes. So Raphael heads our economics research team together and is supported by Faith and Stephanie. These are really the brains behind all the research that comes out of NCBA Bank. And we'd really like to thank you for taking the mantle in thought leadership and ensuring that all this research and content that is developed is available to our customers and even to a broader audience. And I think I'd also like to state that you will be having sector-specific discussions where we'll be able to go into a bit more depth on the budget implications on the specific sectors. But thank you very much for leading this important sessions that we have. A special thank you also to Rosalind Gishuru as our Group Director of Marketing, and Kwanzaa Dave and Joy Muley. I don't know if they can also turn their cameras on so that they can be recognized for the great effort that they have done to ensure that this forum not only reaches our customers, but reaches a much more broader audience and provides a framework for interacting with government and other stakeholders. So thank you very much for all the hard work that you have done here. And last but not least, I'd also like to thank Anna, who's our sign language interpreter, for continuing with all these engagements right from the beginning to the end. We really appreciate your work on this. Last but not least, a big thank you to our customers and the relationship management teams that ensure that we are interacting actively with you. We do not take your custom for granted. We do not take your time for granted. And so we truly appreciate you participating in this forum. With those few words, I'd like to thank all of you and wish you a good day while I hand back to Rosalind.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today. We will see you in the third quarter once again, and we will communicate well in advance regarding the topic of discussion. So with that, have a good day and God bless you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.